Hello, and welcome to a special discussion on one of our most frequently asked questions we are asked by junior military officers. How much money can I make? I'm sitting down with transition coach Rob Davis to cover this topic because it does play a significant role in the transition process, from just starting to consider options outside of the military to interviewing and deciding where to start the next chapter of your career. So after today's discussion, we hope that you will walk away with a better understanding of how compensation is structured in corporate America, what variables you could expect to factor into salary as a military officer looking to make an industry switch. And at the end of our discussion, Rob and I will share with you how you can get personalized feedback on what sort of compensation to expect in corporate America. So before we dive into all of this content, I wanted to introduce Rob Davis.
Thanks, Hope. Yeah, it's great to be here. I appreciate it. I know as a former junior military officer myself, I spent 8 years as an armor officer in the Army. I transitioned through Cameron Brooks, so I am an alumnus, a byproduct of the program, and worked for now 21 years in business. And I know when I came out, I had no idea how compensation worked in corporate America. Obviously, it's a very confusing topic and one I'm excited to share and hopefully shed some light and educate.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us today. And I know you can speak really eloquently on this topic. And I know it's really important and something you probably hear often from officers when you're talking with them, probably even throughout the process. So why don't you dive into why you think this is an important topic for military officers?
Sure. And before I go into that question, I think it's also just important. I shared my background, but really also important for everyone listening or watching, just to understand a little bit of Cameron Brooks. So, we are really the only GMO recruiting firm that really focuses on the transition, right? Helping folks launch a career in the business world. We're focused on junior military officers on the slide, if you can see it. We've got a handful of folks here that are really leading the charge in that. We've got, between all of the folks on this screen, we probably have close to 90 years of combined experience in doing this. And every one of us have been asked this question, like, why is this important? And how much money can I make? And a lot of officers share a concern, like, I know what the pay structure looks like out in corporate America or out in the military. I know what I'm going to be paid as an 03, as an 04, 15 years from now. I know exactly what I'm going to be making because it's public knowledge, it's published. And so in corporate America, it's a bit more of an enigma. Mm-hmm. What are all the forms of compensation? How are they different? What factors play into that? And a lot of officers just, I'm considering a transition, or I want to transition, but can I financially do it? Can I take care of my family? Am I going to be living on food stamps? I mean, what is this thing going to look like if I get out? So I think it's just one where, because it's so known in the military and it's less known, less understood in corporate America, there's that worry and concern. And so it makes sense, which is why we're doing this webcast and podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think I hear that on my end often. I actually just chatted with a military officer, and she said one of her biggest fears in even considering making a transition was she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to financially support herself. So it's scary going from something very solid, very known, to something that's maybe not quite as understood. So hopefully we'll shed some light on that here today. So let's go ahead and kind of dive on into our first question. So Rob, I know we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to cover these options on the screen here, but when companies are looking to hire, what sort of factors play into how they set salary ranges? And I guess really, what can officers expect compensation wise?
Yeah, it's obviously a great question. And there's a lot of factors that go into compensation. So one, how many years of military service do you have, right? So if I'm a 4-year officer versus say a 10-year officer, there are certain roles and positions that we recruit for and our client companies hire for, that years of experience matter. And so obviously the more years of experience you have, typically that compensation will be a little bit greater. Other factors might be your academic background. Does your degree point to business? Is it relevant to the business world? Do you have an engineering degree? Do you have a finance degree? Or do you have something that may not be as relevant to business? History, political science, etc. Doesn't mean that's not applicable, but typically degrees that are more pointed toward the business world also can command a little bit of a higher salary. Do you have a graduate degree? And what is that graduate degree? If I have an MBA versus, say, maybe a master's in intelligence studies or something like that, just as an example, that will also play into it. Certifications to a lesser degree affect compensation because, again, they're not a degree. They didn't take 4 years, 2 years to get it, but things like a PMP, a project management professional, a Six Sigma certification, something that might be relevant to the business world could affect compensation to a certain degree. Another factor is really, what is your military branch, your specialty? As I said, I'm an ex-armor officer. Someone might be an Air Force acquisitions officer, a Navy surface warfare officer, Marine Corps infantry officer. So, some of the branches and specialties, because of the work you do, could also, to some degree, affect compensation, because some of that might be a bit more relevant to the business world. And then the one that's probably the less thought of is, how well can you interview? When you step into, because we specifically screen for salaries as well. So we're bringing a company to a conference, and we're vetting the position they want to hire for. Because one, it's got to be one that is a JMO could interview. Not so much of it, it requires a ton of industry experience or a certain specific niche of expertise. That's probably not going to be as good of a fit. So we're looking for making sure the roles are in line with a JMO's background and experience. And so there's going to be a typical range that companies will offer. Say, hey, for this position in our industry, in this location, this is the range. Once you get into the room, whether it be physical or virtual, and you're interviewing, how well you communicate your background can move you up and down within that range to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's definitely something that we work on really closely with officers in our program, because that is the big, got to get your foot in the door part of the interviewing process. That's right. Good. So you kind of hinted at it. I think for officers who are looking to interview, I think something that does factor into compensation and can factor into compensation is starting with a company that really values your background. So for our listeners, I mean, how can they make sure that a company really values their background and understands them?
Yeah, it's a good question, Hope, and one that's not necessarily easy to answer, because if you're kind of out there, looking through company websites or talking to somebody, or maybe it's an HR person, you don't know. A lot of companies talk about veteran recruiting and valuing the veteran, and a lot that sounds great, but that doesn't mean they understand your background. That doesn't mean they understand the types of roles that are good fits and how to really put you in a position to succeed. That's part of where Cameron Brooks comes in, because that's part of our responsibility when we are bringing companies to our hiring events, to what we call a career conference. We are specifically vetting that company to make sure we understand the industry they play in. Are they a leader in that industry? Where does the initiative to hire a junior military officer come from? What business unit's coming to hire? Who's the hiring manager? Do they have a track record of hiring JMOs and developing them? And so we're really vetting, that opportunity to make sure this is a company that not only appreciates service. I think it's safe to say that all companies appreciate service, but do they know how to take advantage in a positive way, your background, to allow you to thrive in that role and in that organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a great point. And okay, so we've covered factors that can affect compensation as you look to make that industry switch. So let's talk about the different varieties and types of compensations, because I do think that really can differ from the military. So the business world does have a wide range of ways that they do compensate their employees. What forms of compensation should officers know about when considering business opportunities?
Sure. So we think about the military first, right? We have our base pay, we have BAH or basic allowance for housing, and BAS, basic allowance of subsistence. So I butchered that word. But essentially, you kind of have three things. And there, if you're over in a deployed situation, there'd be some other things there. But typically, base pay is exactly what you think of it is. It is typically your annual salary that's being paid. And that's aside from bonuses or other forms of compensation we'll talk about here in a second. So what is your basic annual salary? It's typically paid out either twice a month or on a monthly basis. Some companies allow you to pick that. Some will just be one option versus the other. But it's essentially what you're making on an annual basis. So typically you have what's called salaried employees as opposed to an hourly. The roles we recruit for are typically what we call salaried employees. So you're being paid an annual salary, and that's what your base pay is. So exactly what you think of it is when your base pay in the military, same thing here. But then you've got additional forms of compensation. So one thing that the military does not pay out or doesn't have a form of compensation we call bonuses. And so that's above and beyond your base pay. It's typically taxed differently than your base pay. And that can be different forms. So one of those is a performance-based bonus. So typically that would be a percentage of your annual salary. So it'll be a target percentage of your annual salary. So let's say it's 10%. So if you were making 100 grand a year, that could be 10,000 additional dollars you could earn. And what goes into that? Well, typically in most companies, and every company does it a little differently, that bonus, that performance-based bonus might be based off of how the company performs as a whole. So how do they do relative to their target revenue, profit goals, et cetera. Part of that bonus might also be how you individually perform. So you may sit down with your boss at the end of the year or the beginning of the year and say, hey, here's some specific metrics or targets for you to hit. So part of that bonus might be based on how you individually perform. Some of it might be relevant to how the company as a whole performs. So that's your performance-based bonus. Then you have a commission, right? So typically you're going to see this in the sales career field. So you have a base pay, but then you have a greater variability commission-based bonus based on target revenues you're trying to hit. So in a sales role, you're trying to grow the business, right? So how well you do relative to that, you can earn that commission. So that's why a lot of folks gravitate towards the sales career field, because you can control a greater degree of your compensation based on how you perform, because there's typically no cap on that. You may have a signing bonus. So a lot of companies that we work with, when they make an offer, they'll say, hey, here's a signing bonus for, hey, coming on board. Glad to have you here. And it might be, it's kind of a one-time
welcome
bonus paid. Like, hey, we really want you to come join our company, right? And so
exactly.
Again, one-time signing bonus. And then the other thing you also see is what we call a spot or discretionary bonus. And I used to, when I was working for my first company, Cisco Systems, I would have responsible for helping launch new products into the marketplace. So I would have a cross-functional team that would help me. So I'd have an engineering person, a supply chain person, et cetera. And so when we successfully launched the product, a lot of cases I would put them in for like a spot or discretionary bonus, be a one-time based off of an accomplishment, the conclusion of a project, something along those times. So achieving basically a major goal, or maybe they just had exceptional performance. And it'd be a one-off kind of thing that they could also be rewarded for. So there's a lot of versions of the bonus, if you will. So we got the base pay, we've got different bonuses, and then you also, if you're a publicly traded company, there can also be stock options, and that can be awarded initially when you sign on with the company. That could be done on an annual basis. It could also be a spot or discretionary award as well, based on that. But without getting really complicated, stock options, they're a financial instrument that gives the recipient the ability to purchase a certain number of shares in a company at a certain fixed price. And so they could be, again, what is a signing bonus? It can be done as part of an annual award, spot award, but stock options typically come with a vesting period. So in a lot of cases, it might be like a 5-year period. So if you're awarded 10,000 shares, for example, you get like a fifth of those shares that vest, meaning you can actually cash them in and do something with them financially. So it might be, 2,000 shares, then 2,000 shares, then 2,000, and finally after the 5-year period, you're fully quote unquote vested with the stock option. So then you could, based on the stock price, if you bought them, at $2 per share, and then they grew to $10 per share, obviously you're going to make more money based on how the company overall performs. So that could be a fairly lucrative award in terms of compensation, but it also can go the other way if the company's not doing so great. So obviously there's incentive to help your company perform at its best, because with the stock option, that bodes well for you if the company earns more and their stock price goes up.
Right.
And lastly, you got kind of the overall benefits package. So this necessarily isn't monetary in terms, but that can be additional perks. So it could be family medical leave, subsidized health, dental and vision insurance, unemployment insurance. They could be like tax-free accounts for medical expenses, like what they call a health savings account, flexible spending account. So that can be money you can put in to be used for healthcare, life insurance, what we call PTO. So in the military, you call that leave. We call that paid time off, vacation time. And it also could be retirement plans. So the most common out there would be, everyone's familiar with, is the 401k. So you contribute a certain amount, and a lot of companies will match a certain percentage of what you contribute. So you're basically getting free money into your retirement plan. So a lot of those things go into the overall benefits package. So as you can see, there's just a lot more forms of compensation available to you in the business world than you'll find in the military.
Right. Yeah. And it does vary, obviously based on company, but at least the opportunities that we see come through, I've seen versions of all of these, and it's really exciting to present these to our officers and say, look, let out everything that you could be getting.
To come back to when you talk about base pay and bonuses, and specifically the performance-based bonus, that's why when you look at a military pay scale, I mean, it's very incremental on how things are paid. With a base pay and bonus, they're actually synergistic together. So for example, if let's say you were coming out making $100,000 and you're getting 10% of your bonus, when you get a promotion, that typically means you're going to get a raise that goes along with that promotion. So now let's say you're making $110,000 a year, but now your target performance bonus might go up. So now it's maybe 15%. Whereas before, if it was 10%, making a total comp of 110, now you're 110 times potentially 1.15. So that number, can increase more. So that's why you can make some significant leapfrogs in compensation as those two things rise.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point. Like earnings potential as you kind of accelerate into your business career is, like you said, it can be uncapped, and it's really based on performance. So I think that's an attractive option for military officers that, especially ones we speak with.
Right.
Okay. So now that we better understand the forms of compensation, what sort of variables can affect your salary?
Yeah, so we got the different types of compensation. Now, what kind of affects that? So a big one is location, right? Because there's no such thing as BAH in the business world. So if you're stationed in Hawaii versus, say, Jacksonville, North Carolina, you're going to get a very different basic allowance for housing. That's how the military adjusts for where you're being stationed. In the business world, because BAH does not exist, companies physically change the base salary based on cost of living. So if you went to work for a company in New York City, as opposed to the exact same company, exact same job in Kansas City, the job in New York is going to pay more. So companies will physically adjust the salary based off of that. And that can be significant. Sometimes if you're a higher cost of living, you could be 10, 15, even $20,000 more based on where obviously based on what the role dictates, but based on the cost of living. I think industry is also one of those that adjust. Certain industries simply pay more. Now, why is that? Well, sometimes the work may require to be in a more difficult location. So take energy sector, oil and gas, out there, given the conditions, or maybe a job requires more travel, like things like with consulting, for example. So they're going to compensate a little more based off of the role and the industry. And also, based on the position itself. So sometimes companies, if they have more stringent objective requirements. Hey, this position requires this type of a degree or requires this many years of experience. The more specific the company gets around the objective or criteria means they're going to have a smaller talent pool to pull from, which means they're willing to pay a bit more because they've got to attract that talent. And that could be things that might be industries that are more technical in nature, high tech, medical device, software development. It's just a couple of examples. So I think those things play into the variables. But as I said before, your communication skills, aka crushing the interview, right? So can you get in there and really prove your fit? Can you demonstrate to the company that you have the ability to solve their problem, right? Companies, when they come to us, they have a problem. That problem is they have an open position. That position is designed to bring value to the organization. So if no one's in the role, that's a problem. Think just like in the military. If I'm a company commander and I have an open platoon leader position, that is a problem for me in the organization. If I am a department head and I have a division officer role that's vacant, the billet's been gapped, I've got a problem. So the better you're able to communicate your background, translate your skills, demonstrate how you can solve that company's problem, like I said, that can shift up into the range of the salary. And I think this goes without saying, but I think it's also one that folks don't always think about is, am I in the right fit? Am I in the right position to really capitalize on my skill set? Is this an organization that fits me culturally? So the better job you can do, and that typically means that I found a good company with a good cultural fit, my skill sets translate. So if you can find the right fit, the faster you're going to ramp, the bigger the impact you're going to make, and the quicker you're going to become promoted, which typically translates into an increase in compensation.
Right, exactly. That upward mobility compensation wise. That's awesome. Okay. So thank you for kind of running us through all of those factors and variables. Rob, if officers are curious, to learn more about what salary ranges they could expect specific to their background, and where can they learn more? How can they learn more?
Yeah, great question. So one, akin to this webcast and podcast, we have a white paper that goes a bit more in depth and detail, so they can access that onto the Cameron-Brooks.com website. But specific to them, that is where kind of our conversations come into play. So typically they could reach out to Cameron Brooks, find the transition specialist that works, handles their specific locale. That starts the dialogue, and eventually when they get to me and we're having a conversation around their marketability, their career goals, their strategy, that is something that myself and my two colleagues, Pete Van Epps and Joel Junker, will get into. We'll be able to talk more about the range they can expect relative to their academic background, their military specialty, their years of service, and it can really give them a much better idea and in depth about what they could expect relative to all those things that I just talked about.
Great. Okay. Super. Well, thank you for this discussion today, Rob. And hopefully this discussion that we did have today helped you better understand compensation and salary in corporate America and what you might be able to expect. Again, if you are interested in exploring your options or just learning more about what you could specifically expect, you can reach out to the team at Cameron Brooks. You can email Rob at rdavis@cameron-brooks.com, or you can contact myself, connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. But again, thank you, Rob, for sitting down with us today. This was great.
It's been my pleasure. Hope it's helpful, and look forward to talking to any officer that's wanting to explore their options.
Absolutely. All right.